The poor boy chose helping an elderly stranger over his paid jobs. What appeared at his doorstep the next morning made his mother collapse. Marcus stood at his kitchen window, staring at another overdue bill on the counter. His mother's handwriting showed through the thin envelope. She'd been calculating numbers again. The morning sun cast long shadows across their small kitchen, highlighting the worn spots on the linoleum floor. "Mom, I can skip the park today. Maybe Mr. Johnson needs help with his yard again," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the worry in his chest. Sarah Matthews looked up from her housekeeper uniform, dark circles under her eyes. "Baby, you're 12. You should be playing with your friends, not working. But the bills are my responsibility." She straightened her name tag. "Your only job is to be a kid and keep those grades up." Marcus watched his mother gather her things, her movements slower than usual. Last night, he'd heard her coughing again. The medical bills were getting worse, but she wouldn't talk about it. "I made you lunch," he said, holding up a brown paper bag. "Turkey sandwich, no crust." Sarah's eyes softened. "What did I do to deserve you?" She kissed his forehead, leaving a faint scent of discount store perfume. "I'm working late again. Mrs. Peterson needs extra help with her dinner party. I know the drill. Homework first, then dinner, then bed." After his mother left, Marcus grabbed his backpack and headed out. The morning air was thick with summer heat. Their neighborhood was a patchwork of modest homes and cracked sidewalks, but just 2 blocks over, everything changed. The Thompson mansion stood like a wall between two worlds. Its iron gates and manicured lawns marked the beginning of the wealthy district. Marcus often walked past it on his way to help elderly neighbors with their groceries or yard work. "Hey, Marcus," Mrs. Rodriguez called from her porch. "Could you help me with these bags?" "Sure thing." He jogged over, taking the heavy grocery bags from her arthritic hands. "Such a good boy," she said, fishing in her purse. "Let me give you something No need, Mrs. R. Mom taught me to help neighbors." As he arranged Mrs. Rodriguez's groceries in her kitchen, movement across the street caught his eye. Through her window, he saw an elderly man in a wheelchair struggling with the Thompson mansion's personal assistant. The assistant, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe, was talking on his phone while the old man tried to navigate his wheelchair up a portable ramp. "That's Mr. Thompson," Mrs. Rodriguez said, following Marcus's gaze. "His son owns the mansion, but never visits. Just sends that fancy assistant to check on him." Marcus watched Mr. Thompson's hands shake as he gripped the wheelchair's wheels. The assistant didn't even look up from his phone. "Why doesn't anyone help him?" Mrs. Rodriguez sighed. "People around here, they stick to their own kind. Rich with rich, poor with poor. That's just how it is." But Marcus couldn't look away. Mr. Thompson's face showed a familiar loneliness, the same look his mother had when she thought Marcus wasn't watching. A security guard approached the scene, his hand resting on his belt. The assistant finally looked up from his phone, gesturing dismissively at Mr. Thompson's struggle. Marcus felt his hands tighten into fists. His mother's voice echoed in his head. "We might not have much, but we have our dignity. And helping others, that's the richest thing you could do." The sound of wheels scraping against metal made his stomach turn. Mr. Thompson was losing his grip on the ramp. "I should go," Marcus said suddenly. Mrs. Rodriguez touched his arm. "Marcus, honey, sometimes it's better not to get involved with those people." But he was already moving toward the door. The bills at home, his mother's cough, the tired lines around her eyes, none of it mattered in that moment. Marcus stepped out onto Mrs. Rodriguez's porch, his heart pounding. The morning sun felt hotter now, beating down on his worn t-shirt. Across the street, Mr. Thompson made another attempt at the ramp. The security guard's radio crackled. The assistant's voice carried across the quiet street. "Sir, please wait for the staff to assist you." Marcus took a deep breath and started walking. Sometimes doing the right thing meant crossing more than just a street. He could feel Mrs. Rodriguez watching from her window. Feel the security guard's eyes tracking his movement. Feel the weight of invisible barriers built by money and prejudice. But all Marcus saw was an old man who needed help, and that his mother had taught him was the only thing that mattered. Marcus's sneakers scraped against the hot pavement as he approached the ramp. The security guard's walkie-talkie crackled again, louder this time. "Everything all right here?" the guard called out, his hand still resting on his belt. The personal assistant looked up from his phone, finally noticing Marcus. His expression hardened. "This is private property, kid." Marcus stopped a few feet from the ramp. Mr. Thompson's knuckles were white against the wheelchair's wheels, his breathing heavy from exertion. Marcus's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I just want to help." "We don't need dash," the assistant started, but Mr. Thompson cut him off. "Let him try, Richard." His voice was rough, but carried authority. "You're clearly too busy with your phone." Richard's face flushed red. He stepped back, adjusting his expensive tie. "Sir, I really don't think dash. I didn't ask what you think." Mr. Thompson turned to Marcus, his blue eyes sharp despite his aged face. "What's your name, son?" "Marcus, sir." "Marcus Matthews." "Matthews?" The security guard stepped closer. "Sarah Matthews's boy." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, sir. I know your mother," the guard said, his stance relaxing slightly. "She works hard." Mr. Thompson wheeled back from the ramp. "Well, Marcus Matthews, let's see what you can do." Marcus moved forward, studying the wheelchair's design. He'd helped old Mr. Johnson with his chair before, but this one was different, newer, more complicated. "The brake's on the right," Mr. Thompson said quietly. "And watch the left wheel. It catches sometimes." Marcus positioned himself behind the chair, gripping the handles. "Ready, sir?" "Born ready, boy." The first push was too hard. The chair jerked forward, and Mr. Thompson grabbed the armrests. Richard took a quick step forward, his phone forgotten. "Sorry." Marcus adjusted his grip. "Let me try again." "Take your time," Mr. Thompson said. "I'm not going anywhere." Marcus took a deep breath and pushed more gently. The wheelchair rolled smoothly onto the ramp. He remembered Mr. Johnson's advice. Let the chair tell you what it needs. Halfway up, the left will caught. Marcus felt the resistance and shifted his weight, compensating for the drag. Mr. Thompson made a small sound of surprise. "You've done this before," he said. "Sometimes. For neighbors." Marcus concentrated on keeping the chair steady. "My mom says everybody needs help sometimes." They reached the top of the ramp. Richard stood there, his face a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance. "I'll take it from here," he said, reaching for the handles. "No." Mr. Thompson's voice was firm. "Marcus will help me inside." The mansion's entryway was cool and dark after the morning sun. Marcus's worn sneakers squeaked against the marble floor. Everything smelled like furniture polish and money. "The sitting room," Mr. Thompson directed. "On the left." Marcus wheeled him into a room bigger than his entire house. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. "Thank you, Marcus." Mr. Thompson turned his chair to face him. "That's the first time someone's helped me without being paid to do it." "You're welcome, sir." Marcus shifted his weight, suddenly aware of his threadbare t-shirt and old shorts. "Tell me, why did you decide to help?" Richard appeared in the doorway, hovering like a shadow. Marcus looked at his hands, callous from yard work and odd jobs. Because being alone is hard enough without people making it harder." Silence filled the room. Mr. Thompson studied Marcus's face for a long moment. "How old are you, son?" 12, sir." 12, Mr. Thompson repeated softly. "My own son was 12 when I taught him to ride a bike. Now he's too busy running his company to visit his old man." Richard cleared his throat. "Sir, you have physical therapy in an hour." "Cancel it." Mr. Thompson waved his hand dismissively. "Marcus, would you join me for lemonade?" Before Marcus could answer, Richard stepped forward. "Sir, I must object. We don't know anything about this." "Boy, what's to know?" Mr. Thompson's voice turned sharp. "He saw someone who needed help, and he helped. That tells me everything I need to know." A maid appeared with a tray of lemonade, her eyes darting curiously between Marcus and Mr. Thompson. "Sit." Mr. Thompson gestured to an armchair that probably cost more than 6 months of his mother's rent. Marcus perched on the edge of the seat, accepting a glass with trembling hands. The lemonade was cold and fresh, nothing like the powdered mix they had at home. "Now then," Mr. Thompson settled back in his wheelchair. "Tell me about these neighbors you help." For the next hour, Marcus talked about Mrs. Rodriguez and her arthritis, Mr. Johnson and his garden, old Mrs. Chun who needed help reading her English mail. Mr. Thompson listened intently, asking questions, while Richard paced by the door like a caged animal. Finally, Marcus noticed the time. I should go. My mom will worry. Of course. Mr. Thompson nodded. Richard, see Marcus out. At the door, Marcus turned back. Mr. Thompson, if you need help again, tomorrow? There was something like hope in the old man's voice. The garden needs tending, and Richard has two left thumbs when it comes to plants. Richard's face turned an interesting shade of purple. I'd like that, Marcus said. After school? After school? Mr. Thompson smiled, the first real smile Marcus had seen from him. Walking home, Marcus felt the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. He'd crossed an invisible line, stepped into a world he didn't belong in. But the memory of Mr. Thompson's smile, the way his hands had relaxed on the wheelchair's armrests, made everything else seem less important. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The bills would still be there, his mother would still work too hard, and Richard would probably still look at him like something stuck to his expensive shoes. But for now, Marcus had done what his mother had taught him. He'd helped someone who needed it. And somehow, that felt richer than all the marble floors and fancy lemonade in the world. The next afternoon, Marcus stood at the Thompson mansion's gates, his backpack heavy with homework. The security guard from yesterday, his name tag read Wilson, gave him a small nod. Back again, Matthews? Yes, sir. Mr. Thompson asked me to help with the garden. Wilson pressed a button, and the gates swung open with a soft hum. Stay where people can see you. The warning was clear in his voice. Marcus clutched his backpack straps tighter and walked up the long driveway. Richard waited at the front door, his face set in hard lines. Mr. Thompson is in the garden already. He didn't move to let Marcus pass. Listen carefully. If anything goes missing, I'm not a thief. Marcus met Richard's eyes, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. Everyone has a price. Not me. Marcus thought of his mother, working extra shifts with her bad cough. Some things matter more than money. Richard's lip curled, but he stepped aside. Marcus followed the path around the mansion, his worn sneakers crunching on perfectly raked gravel. He found Mr. Thompson by a neglected rose garden, struggling with pruning shears. These damn things, Mr. Thompson muttered, his fingers shaking on the handles. Let me help. Marcus set his backpack down. My mom taught me about roses. She used to tend them for Mrs. Peterson. Mr. Thompson surrendered the shears. Your mother seems to have taught you a lot. She says education doesn't just come from books. They worked in comfortable silence. Marcus trimmed dead branches while Mr. Thompson pointed out which bushes needed attention. The afternoon sun beat down on them, but neither complained. Sir? Marcus asked after a while. Can I ask you something? You just did? Mr. Thompson smiled. But go ahead. Why did you let me help yesterday? Richard didn't want you to. Mr. Thompson's face grew serious. Richard sees what he expects to see. A boy from the wrong side of the tracks. I see what is a young man who stops to help strangers. A maid appeared with water and sandwiches. She gave Marcus a curious look, but said nothing. Eat, Mr. Thompson commanded. Growing boys need fuel. The sandwich was like nothing Marcus had ever tasted: fresh bread, real turkey, crisp lettuce. He tried to eat slowly, to savor it. Tell me about school, Mr. Thompson said. It's okay. I like math best. Mathematics. Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up. The universal language. What's your favorite part? Problem solving. Finding different ways to get the right answer. Like helping an old man up a ramp? Marcus looked up, surprised. Mr. Thompson was watching him with those sharp blue eyes. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one, Marcus said. Indeed. Mr. Thompson wheeled closer. You know, I built my company on that principle. Now my son runs it with complicated schemes and corporate strategies. A shadow crossed his face. He sends Richard to check on me twice a week. Calls once a month. Says he's too busy for visits. Marcus set down his sandwich. That must be lonely. Lonely? Mr. Thompson laughed without humor. Yes, I suppose it is. Money buys a lot of things, Marcus, but not companionship. Not real care. From the mansion, they heard Richard's voice raised in argument with someone on the phone. He means well, Mr. Thompson said, but he didn't sound convinced. They returned to the roses. Marcus showed Mr. Thompson how to tell which branches needed cutting, guiding his hands on the shears. The old man's fingers were stronger than they looked once they found their purpose. "Your father," Mr. Thompson said suddenly. "Is he gone?" Marcus focused on a thorny branch. "Left when I was 3. Mom says he wasn't ready for responsibility. Some men never are." Mr. Thompson's voice was gentle. "Their loss is greater than they know." The afternoon stretched on. They finished the roses and moved to the vegetable garden, which had gone wild from neglect. Marcus cleared weeds while Mr. Thompson told stories about building his company from nothing. "I started poor as a church mouse," he said. "Worked my way up. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what that felt like. Until yesterday, at 5 o'clock, Wilson appeared at the garden gate. 'Matthews, your mother called the main house. She's asking for you.' Marcus stood quickly, brushing dirt from his knees. 'I have to go? Same time tomorrow?' Mr. Thompson asked. Richard materialized behind Wilson, his face thunderous. 'Sir, tomorrow you have dash tomorrow,' Mr. Thompson said firmly, ignoring Richard. 'The vegetables won't weed themselves.' Walking home, Marcus felt lighter despite his tired muscles. His phone buzzed, a text from his mother. 'Where are you?' 'Everything okay?' He typed back, 'On my way.' 'Got a job helping Mr. Thompson with his garden.' 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, 'The Thompson Mansion? Baby, be careful.' Marcus understood her worry. People like them didn't mix with people like the Thompsons. But Mr. Thompson wasn't just people like that. He was a lonely old man who needed help with his roses. At home, his mother was waiting. She'd changed out of her housekeeper uniform, but exhaustion lined her face. 'Tell me everything,' she said. So Marcus did. About the wheelchair and the ramp. About Richard's suspicion and Mr. Thompson's kindness. About the roses and the stories and the way Mr. Thompson's hands shook less when they had purpose. Sarah Matthews listened, her expression changing from concern to something softer. 'You're so much like your grandfather,' she said finally. 'He never saw barriers, only bridges waiting to be built. Are you mad?' 'Mad?' She pulled him close. 'Baby, I'm proud. Just be smart. Be safe.' That night, Marcus lay in bed thinking about bridges. About the one he'd started building between his world and Mr. Thompson's. About Richard standing guard at one end and his mother worrying at the other. But mostly he thought about Mr. Thompson's words. Money buys a lot of things, but not real care. Tomorrow, he'd cross that bridge again. Because some things, like lonely old men who needed help with their roses, were worth the risk of falling. A week passed. Marcus fell into a new routine. School, homework at the mansion's garden, then home. Today, he pushed Mr. Thompson's wheelchair along the garden path, careful to avoid the bumpy spots he'd learned to recognize. 'The tomatoes are coming in nicely,' Mr. Thompson said, reaching out to touch a green fruit. 'Your mother's tips worked. She knows a lot about growing things.' Marcus adjusted the wheelchair's angle to give Mr. Thompson better access. 'Says everything needs patience and the right kind of care.' Richard watched from the terrace, his phone forgotten for once. His face had settled into a permanent frown since Marcus started coming regularly. 'Sir,' Richard called out, 'your son is on the line.' Mr. Thompson's hand dropped from the tomato plant. 'Take a message. He insists on speaking with you. I insist on enjoying my garden.' Mr. Thompson's voice turned hard. 'With someone who actually shows up?' Richard's face reddened. He disappeared inside, leaving them alone with the vegetables and the late afternoon sun. 'You should talk to him,' Marcus said quietly. 'Your son? Why? So he can tell me about board meetings and profit margins?' Mr. Thompson sighed. 'When was the last time you had a real conversation with your father?' 'Never.' Marcus concentrated on steering around a flower bed. 'Can't miss what you never had.' Mr. Thompson was quiet for a moment. 'Sometimes having someone who's there, but doesn't care hurts more than having no one at all.' From inside, they heard Richard's voice rise and fall, still on the phone. A blast of hot wind rustled the tomato plants. 'Marcus.' Mr. Thompson's voice was different now. 'Why do you keep coming back?' 'Because—' Marcus stopped pushing the chair. 'Because everyone needs somebody. Even if they're rich. Even if they're rich,' Mr. Thompson repeated softly. He turned his head to look at Marcus. Do you know what Richard thinks? That you're after my money. That you're playing some long game. Marcus's hands tightened on the wheelchair handles. I'm not Dash, I know. Mr. Thompson patted Marcus's hand. That's why I trust you. Because you've never once looked at me and seen a wallet with wheels. The garden door slammed. Richard strode toward them, his tie askew. Your son wants to know why you've hired a strange boy as your companion. Richard's voice dripped with disapproval. He's concerned about security risks. Security risks? Mr. Thompson laughed sharply. The only risk to my security is dying of loneliness while my son counts his money and sends lackeys to check on me. Richard flinched. Sir, I dash Marcus. Mr. Thompson cut him off. Would you like a job? Official this time. After school. Helping me with the garden and keeping an old man company. Richard's face went pale. Sir, you can't dash. I can and I will. Mr. Thompson's voice was steel. Unless you'd like to get your hands dirty in the garden. Richard? Marcus stood frozen between them. A real job. Money to help his mother. But Richard's face promised trouble. I should ask my mom first. Of course. Mr. Thompson nodded. Family first. Always. That evening, Marcus missed his usual odd jobs. Mrs. Rodriguez needed her groceries carried. Mr. Johnson's lawn needed mowing. But he couldn't be everywhere at once. His phone buzzed with texts from the neighbors. Marcus, dear, are you coming today? Mrs. Rodriguez, lawn's getting long, son. Mr. Johnson, need help with my mail. Mrs. Chun, his stomach twisted. These people had counted on him for months. But Mr. Thompson's offer hung in his mind. Real money, steady work. At home, his mother listened to his story while stirring soup that was mostly water and bouillon cubes. A real job? She turned from the stove. Baby, that's too risky. Marcus sat at their small kitchen table. Richard hates me being there. Richard isn't signing your paycheck. She tasted the soup, added more water. But this is a big step. Working for people like the Thompsons. Mr. Thompson's different. Marcus traced a crack in the table surface. He's lonely, Mom. Like how you were after Dad left. Sarah Matthews set down her spoon. Marcus, I know it's not the same, but helping him, it feels right. His mother studied his face. The same face that looked back at her every morning, carrying worry too heavy for 12 years. You really care about him, don't you? Yeah. Marcus looked at his hands, dirt still under his nails from the garden. Is that weird? No, baby. She touched his cheek. That's who you are, who I raised you to be. Later that night, Marcus heard his mother coughing in her room. The sound echoed through their thin walls, along with the rustle of papers. More bills, probably. His phone lit up with another text from Mrs. Rodriguez. Everything okay, dear? Haven't seen you in days. Marcus typed back, got a real job, but I'll still help when I can. 3 dots appeared, disappeared. Finally. Good for you, mijo. Just don't forget where you came from. He looked around his small room, at the secondhand furniture and patched walls. As if he could forget. Tomorrow, he'd tell Mr. Thompson yes. Not for the money, though they needed it. Not to spite Richard, though that was tempting, but because sometimes the right thing to do was also the hard thing. His mother taught him that. Through the wall, he heard another cough, another paper rustling, another worry in the night. Marcus closed his eyes, thinking of tomato plants and wheelchair handles and bridges being built one afternoon at a time. Some people thought he was crossing a line, getting above himself. But his mother was right. He was his grandfather's grandson. And sometimes lines needed to be crossed, barriers broken, bridges built. Even if some people didn't like the construction noise. Marcus arrived at the mansion earlier than usual. His mother's coughing had kept them both awake, and he'd left for school before dawn just to let her rest. Now, tired but determined, he found Richard waiting at the gate instead of Wilson. We need to talk. Richard's voice was ice. Follow me? Marcus's stomach tightened, but he followed Richard around the side of the mansion, away from the security cameras. Whatever game you're playing, Richard said, turning sharply, it stops now. I'm not playing any game. Really? Richard pulled out his phone, showed Marcus a screen, then explained this. It was a background check. Marcus saw his address, his school records, his mother's workplace history. Even his father's abandonment was there in cold, digital text. You ran a background check on me? Of course I did. I protect Mr. Thompson's interests. Richard's smile was sharp. Do you know how many people try to scam lonely old men out of their money? Marcus's hands curled into fists. I'm not Dash, save it. Richard pocketed his phone. I've seen 100 kids like you. Poor, desperate, looking for an easy mark. Mr. Thompson isn't a mark. Marcus's voice shook. He's my friend. Richard laughed. Friend? He's one of the richest men in the state. You're a charity case he'll forget about when he gets bored. The words are like punches. Marcus thought of Mr. Thompson teaching him about stocks yesterday, explaining compound interest with patient enthusiasm. You don't know him, Marcus said. I've worked for him for 10 years. You've known him for 2 weeks. Richard stepped closer. Know what I think? I think you saw a lonely old man in dollar signs. That's not true. No. Richard raised an eyebrow. Then why haven't you told him about your mother's medical bills? Marcus froze. How did you dash background check, remember? Quite a stack of hospital bills there. Must be tempting, having a billionaire's ear. Inside the mansion, a door opened. Mr. Thompson's voice carried out. Marcus? Is that you? Richard's face hardened. Make up an excuse. Stop coming. If you don't, I'll make sure Mr. Thompson learns exactly what kind of person you really are. What kind is that? The kind that comes from nothing and should stay there. Marcus felt something snap inside him. Not anger. Something calmer, steadier. You know what kind of person I am? His voice was quiet. Ask Mrs. Rodriguez about the groceries I carry. Ask Mr. Johnson about his lawn. Ask Mrs. Chun about her English mail. Marcus? Mr. Thompson called again. Ask my mom about working 2 jobs with pneumonia because medicine costs too much. Marcus met Richard's eyes. Ask anyone in my neighborhood what kind of person I am. They'll tell you. Is that supposed to impress me? No. Marcus started walking toward the garden. Because you don't matter. Mr. Thompson does. He found Mr. Thompson by the roses, worry lines creasing his face. Everything all right? You're late. Traffic, Marcus lied, hating the taste of it. Ready to check the tomatoes? They fell into their routine. Marcus pushed the wheelchair. Mr. Thompson pointed out new growth. And together they tended the garden that was becoming their shared project. But Richard's words echoed in Marcus's head. He thought about the hospital bills hidden in his mother's drawer. About how easy it would be to mention them. To let Mr. Thompson's generosity solve their problems. You're quiet today, Mr. Thompson observed. Just tired. Mom's not feeling well. Mr. Thompson turned in his chair. Anything serious? This was his chance. One hint about the bills, and everything could change. She'll be fine. Marcus forced a smile. Just needs rest. They worked until sunset. Richard hovered at the edges of the garden, his presence a constant reminder of the morning's threat. At home, Marcus found his mother asleep on the couch, medical bills scattered around her. Her breathing was rough, catching in her chest. His phone buzzed, a text from Mr. Thompson. You did good work today. See you tomorrow. Marcus looked at his mother, then at the bills. Richard's words came back, the kind that comes from nothing and should stay there. He typed back, yes, sir. Tomorrow. Because Richard was wrong. This wasn't about money. It was about an old man who needed someone to see him, not his bank account. About doing what's right, even when it's hard. His mother stirred, coughing. Marcus gathered the bills and tucked them away. Then he got her favorite blanket, the one with only 2 patches, and covered her gently. Marcus, she mumbled. You're late. Had to finish the tomatoes. He kissed her forehead. Go back to sleep. Tomorrow, Richard would still be there with his threats and background checks. The bills would still need paying. His mother would still be sick. But tomorrow, Mr. Thompson would be waiting in his garden. And some things were worth fighting for. Even if the fight wasn't fair. Even if you came from nothing. Especially then. The next morning started with a phone call. Marcus was eating cereal when his mother's phone rang. The hospital's billing department. Yes, I understand, she said, her voice thin. No, I can't. Yes, I know how much is overdue. Marcus watched her hands shake as she wrote down numbers. Numbers that kept getting bigger while their options got smaller. Mom Dash, she held up a hand, still listening. When she hung up, her face was gray with exhaustion. Nothing to worry about, she said automatically. Finish your breakfast. But Marcus had already seen the number she'd written. $5,000. Past due. At school, he couldn't focus. His math teacher called on him twice, but the numbers on the board kept turning into hospital bills in his mind. After school, Wilson was back at the gate. "Rough day, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired?" Marcus adjusted his backpack. "Is Mr. Thompson in the garden?" "With Richard." Wilson's face turned serious. "Watch yourself today. Richard's been making calls all morning." The warning followed Marcus down the long driveway. He found Mr. Thompson and Richard in heated discussion by the roses. "It's not your decision," Mr. Thompson was saying. "I don't care what Thomas thinks. Your son has legitimate concerns," Richard insisted. "The board dash can go to hell." Mr. Thompson spotted Marcus. "Ah, finally, someone who actually wants to talk about something besides money." Richard's face darkened. "We're not finished, Dash." "Yes, we are." Mr. Thompson wheeled toward Marcus. "How are you at chess, young man?" "Never played, sir." "Perfect time to learn." Mr. Thompson gestured to the terrace. "Richard, bring us the chess set. Unless you're too busy making calls about me." Richard disappeared inside, his shoulders rigid with anger. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "I don't want to cause trouble." "Trouble?" Mr. Thompson laughed. "Boy, you're the only person here who doesn't treat me like a problem to be managed." They set up the chessboard on the terrace table. Mr. Thompson explained each piece's movement, his voice gaining strength as he taught. "Chess is life," he said. "Every move has consequences. Every piece has value." Richard returned with papers requiring signatures. Mr. Thompson waved him away. "The bishop moves diagonally," Mr. Thompson continued. "Like people who never approach things directly." Marcus thought of Richard's threats, of hospital bills and background checks. What if Marcus moved a pawn? What if the other player's stronger? Strength isn't everything. Mr. Thompson took the pawn with his knight. Strategy matters more. Integrity most of all. But what if they can hurt you? Mr. Thompson's hands stilled on his queen. "Has someone threatened you, Marcus?" "No, sir." The lie tasted bitter. "Just thinking about the game?" Mr. Thompson studied him. "You know, when I started my company, bigger firms tried to crush me. Said I didn't belong in their world. What did you do?" "Kept my integrity. Worked harder." He moved his queen. "Let them underestimate me." Inside the mansion, they heard Richard's voice rise in argument again. "Your son," Marcus said quietly. "He really doesn't like me being here? Thomas hasn't earned the right to an opinion about my life." Mr. Thompson's voice was steel. He gave that up when he decided board meetings were more important than family dinners. A door slammed. Richard stormed onto the terrace, his tie askew. "Sir, you need to hear this." He thrust his phone forward. "The board is concerned about unauthorized persons having access to Dash." "Marcus," Mr. Thompson cut in. "Would you like to know what the board doesn't know?" Richard went pale. "Sir Dash, they don't know that my own son sent a private investigator to follow me last month. To prove I'm losing my faculties." Mr. Thompson's laugh was bitter. "Because heaven forbid an old man want company instead of profit margins." Marcus looked between them, feeling the weight of unspoken words. "You see, Marcus," Mr. Thompson continued, "some people think money is everything. They forget that the richest man in the world is poor without friendship." "This is inappropriate," Richard snapped. "No, Richard. Inappropriate is running background checks on a 12-year-old boy." "Yes," he added as Richard flinched. "Wilson told me." Silence fell on the terrace. In the garden, the roses Mr. Thompson and Marcus had tended together bloomed red against the coming evening. "Sir," Marcus said finally, "maybe I should go." "Do you want to go?" Marcus thought about Richard's threats, about hospital bills and background checks, and all the ways the world tried to keep people in their place. "No, sir." "Then stay." Mr. Thompson moved his king. "Your move, son." Richard stood frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand. Marcus studied the chessboard, seeing the pieces differently now. Every move had consequences. Every piece had value. He moved his knight, protecting his king. Mr. Thompson smiled. "Well played." Later, walking home, Marcus passed Mrs. Rodriguez's house. She was on her porch, watering plants. "Haven't seen you in a while, Mejijo," she called. "Been busy?" Marcus stopped at her gate. "But I can help with groceries tomorrow if you need. You've got your fancy new job now. Some things matter more than jobs." He thought of Mr. Thompson teaching him chess. of moves and consequences. Need any help with those plants? Mrs. Rodriguez's face softened. Come on up, then. As he helped her with the watering, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. A certainty. Richard was wrong. Coming from nothing didn't mean staying nothing. It meant understanding the value of everything. Even a chess game on a mansion terrace. Even a lonely old man who saw past bank accounts to the heart beneath. Even a boy who chose to stay, despite the cost. Because some moves change more than just the game. The knock came at dawn. 3 sharp raps that cut through the early morning silence. Marcus was already awake, making tea for his mother's cough. Mom, he called toward her bedroom. Someone's here? No answer. The night shift at her second job had gone late. The knock came again. Marcus opened the door to find Wilson, still in his security uniform. Special delivery. Wilson pointed to a long black box on their worn welcome mat. Mr. Thompson asked me to make sure you got this personally. Marcus stared at the box. It was elegant, with a silver ribbon and a heavy envelope attached. What is it? Above my pay grade, kid. Wilson managed a tired smile. But he was very specific about the timing. Said you'd understand why. After Wilson left, Marcus brought the box inside. It was lighter than he expected. The envelope had his name in Mr. Thompson's shaky handwriting. His mother's bedroom door opened. Baby? Who was at the door? Package from Mr. Thompson. Marcus held up the box. Should I? Sarah Matthews wrapped her robe tighter, suppressing a cough. Open it. The envelope first. Inside, a letter on heavy paper. Dear Marcus, yesterday you taught me something about integrity. About choosing what's right over what's easy. Now let me teach you something about justice. The world isn't fair, but sometimes we get chances to balance the scales. Inside this box is your future. And maybe a bit of my redemption. Your friend, Edward Thompson P.S. Check your mother's email. Marcus's hands shook as he lifted the box lid. Inside lay a single key fob with a familiar luxury car logo. Mom? His voice cracked. Check your email. Sarah Matthews pulled out her phone, frowning. Her eyes went wide. This can't. She sat heavily on their worn couch. Marcus, he paid all the medical bills and set up a trust for your education. The key fob felt heavy in Marcus's hand. Through their thin walls, they heard Mrs. Rodriguez's morning radio. Traffic starting on the main road. The normal sounds of their world continuing while everything changed. There's more, his mother whispered, still reading. A job offer. At the main Thompson corporate office. Full benefits, regular hours. Marcus thought about chess pieces and consequences. About moves that changed more than just the game. His phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Thompson. The car's in your driveway. Richard's face when I signed the paperwork was worth every penny. Come see me when you can. The roses need tending. Outside, through their small window, morning sunlight gleamed off a new luxury car. Their neighbors were already gathering, murmuring in confusion. Mom? Marcus held out the key. Are you okay? Sarah Matthews looked at the key, then at her son. Really looked at him, seeing not just her little boy, but the young man he was becoming. Did you ask for this? No. Marcus met her eyes. Never. I just helped someone who was lonely. She pulled him close, her tears falling into his hair. Like I always taught you. Like you always taught me. They held each other while the morning light grew stronger, while their neighbors' whispers got louder, while the weight of years of struggling began to lift. Finally, his mother pulled back, wiping her eyes. We should go thank him. Now. Now. She looked at her phone again, at the email that had changed everything. But first, I need to call the hospital. Tell them they can stop sending bills. Marcus watched her dial, her hands steady for the first time in months. Through the window, Mrs. Rodriguez was crossing the street, probably coming to ask about the car. His phone buzzed again. Richard, this doesn't change anything. You're still not one of us. Then Mr. Thompson. The roses are particularly beautiful this morning. And Richard's resignation letter was even more beautiful. Marcus smiled, thinking of chess pieces and consequences. Of moves that changed everything. Because Richard was wrong. This didn't change anything important. Marcus was still who he'd always been, his mother's son, his grandfather's grandson, a boy who helped people because it was right. The car, the money, the trust fund, they were just pieces on the board. The real game was played in moments of choice, of integrity, of doing what's right when no one was watching. His mother finished her call, happy tears still falling. Ready to go, thank Mr. Thompson? Yeah. Marcus picked up the key fob. But can we stop at Mrs. Rodriguez's first? She usually needs help with groceries on Thursdays. Sarah Matthews looked at her son, really looked at him, and smiled through her tears. Because some things money couldn't change. Some things money shouldn't change. Like a boy who remembered to help his neighbors, even on the morning his world turned upside down. Like a mother who taught him that kindness mattered more than cash. Like roses that needed tending, no matter how fancy the car that drove you to them. Mrs. Rodriguez first, his mother agreed. Then Mr. Thompson, because they were still who they'd always been, just with fewer bills to worry about, and a much nicer car to help carry groceries. A month passed. The calendar pages turned quietly, but everything else shifted like tectonic plates beneath their feet. Marcus sat in the garden with Mr. Thompson, pruning roses in the late afternoon sun. The wheelchair gleamed with new polish, but Mr. Thompson's hands were still dirt-stained from their work. Your mother starts her new job Monday? Mr. Thompson asked, expertly deadheading a bloom. Yeah, she's nervous. Marcus collected fallen petals in a basket. Says it's different, being on the other side of the desk. She'll do wonderfully. Mr. Thompson wheeled closer to inspect a thorny branch. The best leaders remember what it's like in the trenches. The mansion's back door opened. A new assistant, younger, kinder-faced than Richard, stepped out. Mr. Thompson, your son's here. Mr. Thompson's hands stilled on the roses. Send him out. Marcus started to stand. I should go stay. Mr. Thompson's voice was firm. Thomas met the boy who taught his father about integrity. Thomas Thompson walked into the garden like he owned it, which technically he did. Expensive suit, manicured nails, face lined with board meetings and profit margins. Dad, he stopped short at the sight of Marcus. I didn't realize you had company. This is Marcus. Mr. Thompson continued pruning. He helps me with the roses and the chess and remembering what matters. Thomas's jaw tightened. The boy from the trust fund paperwork. The boy who saw an old man struggling with his wheelchair, Mr. Thompson corrected. While others watched their phones, silence fell in the garden. Marcus focused on the roses, feeling Thomas's stare like a physical weight. You fired Richard over him. Richard fired himself. Mr. Thompson set down his pruning shears. Tell me, Thomas, when was the last time you visited without paperwork to sign? I'm running your company Dash. You're running after money. Mr. Thompson wheeled to face his son. While a 12-year-old boy runs towards someone who needs help, Marcus gathered his tools, trying to make himself invisible. But Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. Do you know what Marcus did with his first paycheck for helping me? Thomas's face tightened further. Enlighten me. Bought groceries for his elderly neighbor. Helped another with her garden. Used the new car to drive a third to her doctor's appointment. How charitable, Thomas said flatly. No. Mr. Thompson's voice sharpened. How human? More silence. In it, Marcus heard old wounds bleeding. Father and son, separated by more than garden paths. The board wants oversight of your decisions, Thomas said finally. The board can want whatever it likes. Mr. Thompson turned back to his roses. I still own controlling interest. Marcus, Mr. Thompson cut in. Would you explain to my son why the roses need pruning? Marcus looked up, caught between father and son. But Mr. Thompson's eyes were kind, encouraging. Deadwood, Marcus said quietly. If you don't cut it away, it kills the healthy growth. Thomas blinked. Mr. Thompson smiled. Exactly. He pointed to a withered branch. See this? Looks important. Thick, established. But it's choking the new buds. Is this a metaphor? Thomas asked stiffly. No, son. It's a rose bush. Mr. Thompson handed him the pruning shears. Want to try? Thomas stared at the shears like they might bite. Then, slowly, he took them. Not so tight, Marcus found himself saying. You'll crush the stem. Thomas adjusted his grip. The shears snipped. A dead branch fell. Good, Mr. Thompson said softly. Now there's room for new growth. They worked together as the sun set. Father, son, and the boy who'd somehow bridged their worlds. Marcus taught Thomas about water pressure for delicate blooms. Thomas's suit got dirty. Mr. Thompson watched them both. Later, Marcus's mother pulled up in their new car, still strange to see in their driveway, but less so every day. How was orientation? Marcus asked as she hung up her new office clothes. Different, she smiled tiredly. But good. Mr. Thompson called personally to see how it went. He does that? Marcus thought of the garden, of Thomas learning to prune roses. Mom, are we different now? Different how? Because of the money, the car, your job. Sarah Matthews sat beside him on their couch, new, but just as comfortable for cuddling as the old one. Do you still help Mrs. Rodriguez with her groceries? Yeah. Still tend Mr. Thompson's roses? Of course. Still my boy who sees people, not bank accounts? Marcus leaned into her side. Yeah. Then we're exactly who we've always been. She kissed his forehead. Just with better medical coverage. His phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Thompson. Thomas asked about coming to dinner next week. Progress, like roses, takes time. Thank you. Marcus showed his mother the message. Seems you're growing more than roses in that garden, she said. Dead wood, Marcus explained. Sometimes you have to cut it away. She hugged him close, understanding more than he said. Because some things didn't change with bank balances. Some things grew stronger like roses after pruning. Like a boy's capacity to help. Like a mother's pride. Like an old man's heart. Opening like new blooms in spring. 6 months later, Marcus stood at his front gate, watching Mrs. Rodriguez try to parallel park her old car. Without hesitation, he jogged over to help guide her in. Thank you, Mihijo. She patted his cheek. Still the same helpful boy, even with your fancy new life? Marcus smiled, thinking how little had actually changed. Yes, their house had new windows that didn't leak. Yes, his mother's cough was gone, thanks to proper medical care. But the important things, the real things, stayed the same. Need help with groceries today? He asked. No. Your mother told me you have your big meeting. The meeting. Marcus checked his watch. An hour until he had to be at Thompson Industries. It had been Mr. Thompson's idea. Time to show the board what real investment looks like, he'd said last week in the garden. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Thompson. Car's on the way. Dad's excited about your presentation. That was new too. Thomas's regular visits, his gradual transformation from distant CEO to actual son. It started with Rose pruning and grew like everything else in the garden with proper care. The company car pulled up, not as flashy as their first gift, but elegant in its own way. The driver, an older man named Jenkins, tipped his hat. Ready, Mr. Matthews? Marcus straightened his tie, a gift from his mother, bought with her new salary. Ready? The drive to Thompson Industries headquarters took 15 minutes. Through the window, Marcus watched his neighborhood blur into downtown's glass towers. Two worlds, no longer quite so separate. In the lobby, Mr. Thompson waited in his wheelchair, Thomas standing beside him. They matched now, both wearing gardening dirt under their manicured nails. Nervous? Mr. Thompson asked as they rode the elevator. A little, Marcus admitted. Good. Thomas smiled, something he did more often now. Means you care? The boardroom was intimidating. All dark wood and leather chairs. The board members watched Marcus with mixed expressions. Some curious, some skeptical, all waiting. Mr. Thompson wheeled to the head of the table. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago, you questioned my judgment about a certain trust fund. Today, Marcus will show you what real return on investment looks like. Marcus stepped forward, thinking of chess moves and consequences. Of roses and dead wood and new growth. The Matthews Foundation, he began, started with one idea. Everyone needs help sometimes. But help isn't just about money. He clicked to his first slide, Mrs. Rodriguez's building, now with a community garden where there used to be abandoned cars. We took the trust fund money and did something different. Instead of just giving handouts, we're building bridges, more slides. Mr. Johnson teaching neighborhood kids about lawn care. Mrs. Chen's English classes in the community center. Small changes that grew into bigger ones. When you help one person, Marcus continued, they help others. It spreads. Grows. Like roses if you tend them right. The board members shifted in their seats. Thomas leaned forward, really listening. In 6 months, we've created 15 jobs, started 3 community programs, and helped 30 families start small businesses. Marcus clicked to the final slide, a picture of his old neighborhood, transformed not by money, but by hope. But the real change isn't in the numbers. He looked at Mr. Thompson, who nodded encouragingly. It's in the connections. The deadwood we cleared away wasn't just in the garden. Silence fell. Then, slowly, one board member started clapping. Others joined. Thomas beamed with genuine pride. After the meeting, back in the garden, Mr. Thompson handed Marcus the pruning shears. You did good, son. We did good, Marcus corrected, starting on a wayward branch. All of us? Thomas joined them, rolling up his expensive sleeves. Need another pair of hands? They worked together as the sun set. 3 generations of growth and change. Inside, the new assistant, who actually cared about plants, brought them lemonade. Marcus's phone buzzed. His mother, Mrs. Rodriguez, told me about your speech. So proud of you, baby. Another text from Mrs. Chun. English class full today. Many thanks. And another from Mr. Johnson. Lawn care program kids graduated. When you start in the next class? Marcus showed the messages to Mr. Thompson, who smiled. See? Some investments can't be measured in dollars. Like helping an old man with his roses? Marcus grinned. Exactly. Mr. Thompson reached for a bloom. Though the car was a nice touch. Thomas laughed. A real laugh, not the boardroom kind. Dads always had a flair for the dramatic. They worked until dark, 3 pairs of hands in the soil. Different backgrounds, different stories, same garden. Later, driving home in the car that started everything, Marcus thought about journeys. About crossing streets and building bridges. About roses that bloomed because someone took time to care. His mother waited on their porch, new, but still perfect for evening talks. Good day? She asked. Marcus looked at his dirty hands, so much like Mr. Thompson's now. The best kind, because some things did change. Deadwood got pruned. New growth flourished. Barriers fell. But the important things, the real things, stayed the same. Like a boy who helped his neighbors. Like a mother who taught him how. Like an old man who saw past appearances to the heart beneath. Like roses that bloomed with proper tending. The next morning, Marcus would help Mrs. Rodriguez with her groceries. Visit Mr. Johnson's lawn care class. Check Mr. Thompson's roses. And somewhere, in the garden of second chances, new growth would push through old soil, reaching for the light. Because that's what happens when you tend what matters. When you remember where you came from. When you help others get where they're going. When you build bridges instead of walls. One rose at a time. One person at a time. One morning at a time. Until the garden grows wide enough for everyone.